Hi everybody, and this is my second lecture for Digital Learning Games, the Tallinn Summer School Digital Learning Games uh, Serious Games course. And we're going to be talking today about game mechanics. Before we get started into game mechanics, we have to understand what a game is. And there are several answers to this question. And I'm sure that you've heard this several times from other teachers, but let's just briefly touch on it yet again. There's the first approach, which is the sociological approach, which really can be summarized as the idea of the magic circle. Games are something that happens inside an environment and that people suspend their disbelief while they enter into the environment and behave differently in this environment than they do in real life. Next, we have the pragmatic approach. The pragmatic approach is normally adopted by actual game designers, and it tends to be a series of statements of things that they believe help in the design of games. So one of the classic ones is that a game is a series of interesting choices. This is Sid Meier's, the creator of Civilization's, favorite description. And finally, we have the structuralist approach, where a game must have a goal, rules, feedback, and voluntary participation. I firmly believe when engaging in game design, especially when looking at mechanics, it's best to keep in mind either a pragmatic or a structuralist approach. This might be because I am a little bit of a structuralist at heart. So, let's move on. There are two questions that we have to ask about mechanics before we can start designing them. The first is, what is your player going to do? If we don't know what our player is going to do, we can't design the system around it. And this can be broken down into a couple of steps. First, we're going to look at the two goals of serious games. Again, adopting that structuralist approach that we have goals and then followed by rules, then followed by feedback. So we're going to look at the two goals that are inherent in serious games. Then next, we're going to look at the atom of play. After that, we're going to look at what is known as the grammar of the game. And finally, we're going to bring it all together into creating a core loop. The next and important question to ask is, how does the machine know what to do? And there's a big difference between player rules and operational rules, which we need to look at. Player rules are things like how the player knows how to play the game versus what you have to tell the machine. So let's take a look at the two competing goals of serious games. We've got the serious, first of all, we've got the serious or the learning goal. And this is the thing that you are designing for. It is your intervention. It is your, I want this game to solve this problem. The purpose of the game that makes it serious. However, there is a big difference between this and the ludic or player goal. And the ludic or player goal is, how do you win the game? What are the victory conditions? When looking at games that are used in the classroom, the biggest mistake that teachers make when accessing games is they fail to realize that the goal that they have as teachers does not necessarily match the goal that the players have as students. So, to borrow from language teaching, the goal of the game might be to teach the present continuous. That's the serious goal. But the learning goal, the ludic goal, the player goal, is to get through it as fast as possible so that we can get over with this class and get out of here. Again, The difference between these can make a big difference in the development of the game. So try for a moment to think about what is your serious or learning goal, and how would you define the victory conditions? How do we know that the game is over and that the player has won or lost? Okay, next we're going to talk about the atom of play. And this is taken from The Characteristics of Games by Ellis, Garfield, and Gushera, and that was published in 2012. The atom of play is the smallest action, the smallest unit of play that can take place and still have the player playing the game. So what's the tiniest thing that the player can do and still be playing the game? So let's take the example of football, or for our American audience members, soccer. The smallest unit of play is simply kicking the ball. This is fundamental to football, and it builds from there. Then, if we move to a different game, we can look at chess. And again, here, the smallest unit of play is picking up a piece and moving it to a new square. Those are the fundamentals, the very, very basics. Now, where most serious games fail is they don't link the serious goal to these atoms of play. They don't link what it is that you're attempting to achieve to what the players are going to do again and again and again. If we do link it, the content between the game, the content, and the play will be well meshed together, and we end up with something called endogenous design. If we don't link it together, we run the risk of creating what is known in the game design industry as chocolate-covered broccoli. The game is layered over the top of something, and they don't mesh together, and they taste terrible. So think about what is the smallest skill that you want your players to practice. Or think about what chunks of learning can you look at and go, hey, I can turn that into a game and move forward with it. Okay, so we have the grammar of games, and this is taken from ideas from Anthropy and Clark's A Game Design Vocabulary. So first of all, we have to ask ourselves, what is the player doing? The second question we're going to ask is, what is our player using to do this thing? So, what the player is doing, you can think of it in terms of grammar as the verbs, the action words. So in chess again, the action word is move. Players are moving pieces on the board. With rock, paper, scissors, the player is simply choosing which one they are going to present. In digital games, these are normally tied to button presses. If we take a look at a fighting game, A is punch, B is kick, C is block. And these things are tied together, and the combinations that are used create larger sequences, which gives us our dynamics. Now we get to what is the player using. And the player is using, really, if we think of it in terms of language, the player is engaging with nouns. And these nouns are identical to the resources that the player is using. So if we go back to chess, they are moving. What are they moving? Well, they're moving a chess piece. If we go back to rock, paper, scissors, they are choosing. Well, what are they choosing? Well, they're choosing rock, paper, or scissors. Understanding that you have the verb of what the player is doing, then followed by the noun of what it is that they are acting on or with, will give you a clear idea of the steps that the player is taking. The nouns in the grammar of games are really tied to in-game objects. And these in-game objects, when you start listing them, when you start listing your verbs and you start listing your nouns, you start instantly creating a list of assets that you are going to develop and build. So we have many, many different actions that are available, from attacking to rating to recommending to sharing to taunting to exploring to expressing, voting. All of these things are possible inside a game. What you need to think about is which actions are key to your game. A good exercise is to take a large list of verbs, pick 5, and then rank them from number 1 to number 5 to understand which actions you want the players to be doing most. If we don't know what actions we want our players to take, we cannot encourage them towards the actions. If we don't know the actions that our players are going to take, we cannot design a system to accommodate those actions. Now we're going to talk about the core loop. So we have the idea of the smallest unit of play. We've moved on from there to look at how we can expand the smallest unit of play by looking at the actions. And now we're going to look at the idea of the core loop in terms of players' choices. Because the difference between a game and a book is that players have choice. They can make choices and take action that changes the environment. So, if we look at the very, very basic core loop, we have a player making a decision. Then the computer applies the rules to this decision, and a new situation is displayed. And the player analyzes the situation, and the player makes a decision. The computer applies the rules, new situation is displayed. And this creates a loop that keeps going on and on and on. And that is your fundamental, simplest loop. We could apply it to rock, paper, scissors. Player decides to throw rock. Other player decides to throw scissors. Apply the rules. Rock crushes scissors. New situation. Player 1 has won. Player 1 puts his hand behind his back and analyzes the situation and makes a new decision on what to play next. Simplest core loop out there. However, core loops can be made more complex by the addition of the resources that we had talked about before. So if we take a look at a core loop, a slightly more complex core loop, we have this one from an online Star Wars game. If we look, the player chooses to engage in a battle. In the battle, they gain these resources. They then use those resources to increase their character stats, and then they go back into a battle where they lose energy. Energy is replaced via time, and it becomes a repeating cycle. Or we can look at, this is again a very simple and tight core loop. However, we can take a look at a slightly more complex one, where the player has more choices. So in this one from Game of War, the player decides, am I going to build, am I going to research, am I going to craft, or am I going to train? Again, if you notice there, we have our verbs front and center: build, research, craft, train. Okay? When they decide to build, they gain these resources, but they lose other resources. Research, same thing. And then we add time into the system, and this brings us to level up, which unlocks more things and makes things more available. Again, having this core loop helps you to visualize what it is your players are going to do. So let's talk about operational rules. Operational rules are slightly different than player rules. Player rules are what players need to understand in order to play the game, or the sort of guidelines that players develop that help them to master the game. Operational rules, however, are the rules for the computer. And it's important to remember, computers are not very smart. They are incredibly logical, but they have to be told everything. Everything must be made clear to them. There is an exercise in human-computer interaction for first-year human-computer interaction students where a professor traditionally asks students to explain to a computer how to make toast. This seems like a very simple concept, but unfortunately for a computer, you first have to define what is bread, what is pick up, what is put, and every fine detail needs to be defined. But when we bear this in mind, we can look at our interaction loops and we can start to do something very useful. We can start to convert the core loops into a pseudocode. A pseudocode is not any particular coding language, but it's a formalized way of looking and explaining what it is that you want to do. It's taking human language and translating it into how you would explain it to a machine. If player X decides Y, then ... else, and another condition. By putting those together, we have a very clear idea, and when we're talking to our programmers, have an opportunity to be very clear and concise about what it is we are looking for the program to do. This will speed up the process dramatically and also make it a lot less frustrating. So at this stage, if you've followed along and you've taken some notes for yourself, you should have a couple of things written down on some pieces of paper. The first thing you should have written down is a description of your game goals. And this is both the learning goal, or the serious goal, and the ludic, or the victory conditions, the player's goal. The next thing you should have is a list of actions. You should have between 3 and 5 actions for a simple game that players can choose from. What it is that you want the players to be able to do. You should also have a list of game resources. The list of actions was your list of verbs, and the list of game resources are your nouns, what it is that the players are manipulating, and how you work through them. You should also have a diagram of your core interaction loop or loops, the common looping decisions that are made, to explain what it is that keeps the system flowing and moving. And hopefully you should have a bit of pseudocode for your programmers to help to explain what it is that you're doing. Now, while there are many other things that we could talk about, we could move from here into a discussion of balancing mechanics, how to ensure that the economy of your game world is viable, the use of torture breaks in online and casual gaming, to the use of microtransactions, all of those things. Those are all discussions that build off of the core that we've talked about today. So, as always, if you have any questions, you can hit me up by sending me an email to my email address here, or you can find me on the forums. Again, thanks to my wonderful artist friend, Irina, for my avatar. And thank you to Rundown Universe, who are the guys behind my wonderful sound recording. Thank you very much, guys, and I look forward to seeing you later. Bye.